Instead of a usual Novara Live today, we have an interview with a distinguished guest on a meaty topic. Does economic growth make the world go around? Or to live good, sustainable lives, do we need to get over our growth obsession? This is a hot topic right now, and there have been a few high-profile recent interventions. So in early June, a team led by French economist Thomas Piketty released their Global Justice Report, and that sought to set out a vision for a world that can prosper within planetary boundaries. Their plan is pretty radical, so they think income should converge at around 5,000 euros a month in every country, which leaves lots of room for growth in the developing world, but would mean potentially an end to growth in the global north. A week later, a group of economists, including Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz, published a joint letter in The Guardian. We economists have done the maths. Growth is a doomed strategy. There is a better way. That letter argued that growth had become or has become decoupled from poverty reduction, and that economic growth is inconsistent with avoiding environmental catastrophe, or at least unconstrained economic growth. Both the Piketty letter and the Stiglitz letter argued for much more international coordination of the world economy, much higher taxes on the wealthy, and much larger redistribution between countries. This, not economic growth, they argue, can lead to a world of shared prosperity. Not everyone, though, has accepted the conclusions of these reports, especially with the claims about moving beyond economic growth. In the Financial Times, data journalist John Byrne-Murdoch argued that the arguments for degrowth are in fact shrinking. He says that once you look at the data, growth, while not the root of progress for everyone, is actually pretty close. So he argues that growth has actually allowed richer countries to move away from fossil fuels and towards renewables, and that the connection between economic growth and poverty reduction remains empirically very strong. So who's right? Well, to look more into the degrowth side of the argument, I spoke to Jayati Ghosh. She was the third signatory on the letter signed by Joseph Stiglitz. Ghosh is a very distinguished heterodox development economist. She taught at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi for 35 years, and since 2021 has been professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. To give a bit of an introduction, what brought you to development economics? What made you a critic, I suppose, of mainstream economics?
Well, what brought me to economics, if I can start with, I actually started studying sociology because I was interested in how societies work. And the more I studied it, I realized that there's a lot going on that can be explained by things I didn't understand, which was the economy. So I actually then switched to economics, and I did most of my degrees in economics after that. But I now realize you can't really understand the economy without understanding society. So I've kind of come full circle.
Also, and your career, so you were for 35 years at Nehru University in India.
Yes.
You're now at Amherst University in the United States. Talk to me about that. What was it like being an academic for 35 years in India?
I loved it. I was at Jawaharlal Nehru University, which is a postgraduate university with students from very, very different backgrounds, some first-generation learners, a very lively place, full of ideas, full of lots of argument, full of ferment. So yeah, I loved it.
Let's talk about growth. So this has been a big sort of topic of debate this month. You co-signed a recent letter in The Guardian saying economic growth is a doomed strategy. I suppose, could you explain what you're thinking, what sort of prompted that intervention?
Absolutely. So, well, there are two things really that have to be brought in here. One is that when we're talking about economic growth, what are we counting? We're counting GDP, which is the sum of all the marketed transactions and some imputed transactions. And that can take, well, first of all, there's a distributional part. Who's it going to? Who's getting the benefits of that growth? But secondly, there is the broader question about, if you like, what is the economy for? Why do we want this GDP to grow? So what we are really questioning is the idea that we want the growth for itself. That, that the reason for growth is because economies just have to grow. That's the ideology of the cancer cell. That's not, the ideology, if you like, that should permeate your social thinking. So if we start thinking of it the other way, that the economy should serve society, not the other way around, then you say, well, what is the economy that will give us our social goals within planetary boundaries? And there is where you have to move beyond growth, because meeting your social goals may require you to increase your GDP, but it may not. You may actually increase GDP, improve your social goals by reducing pollution, having a public, green, clean system of public transport, rather than a very polluting and congesting privatized system of transport. The second will have more GDP. The first will have a better quality of life. So it's really a question of what do you want the economy for? And I would say you want the economy to generate a better quality of life for everyone in it.
Let's park sort of growth in developing countries or the global south, because I know you sort of said there should be some room for it, and where you think basically it's unnecessary is in the global north. Unless I'm putting words into your mouth.
I think it's a little oversimplistic. I won't say it's unnecessary. I would say it depends. I would say that we shouldn't be looking at growth as the aim. It may be that in some rich countries, when you do all the other strategies you want, there is an increase in GDP as a byproduct. It may well be. It may well be that there isn't, that it's the same GDP or it's lower GDP. I mean, what I'm saying is that is not the goal. That's a byproduct, and it doesn't really matter which way it is, so long as you're getting the better quality of life.
I suppose an argument against degrowth, or sort of an ambivalence about growth in the global north, because I totally accept the argument that sort of presumably in the global north we've kind of got enough if we distribute it well, right? Sort of people 100 years ago would say you've got more than enough stuff. What are you doing? At the same time, it does seem like politics, especially sort of liberal democratic politics, struggles in a context of very low growth. And we've had very low growth in the UK for the past 20 or so years. Growth across the West has been relatively slow, a bit faster in America, but across Europe, it's been relatively slow for the past decade or so. And so far, the evidence doesn't seem to be that this has made everyone think, okay, well, maybe what we could do is distribute it, and what we could do is think about green politics. We'll have this wonderful progressive vision instead of this one focused on growth. It seems to have benefited the right. It's made people think in more zero-sum terms. I don't think it's helped when it comes to the politics of migration. So is there, even if there's an economic argument that the West or the global North doesn't need necessarily much more growth, is there a political argument that our political systems can't really handle it? We can't handle a context of low growth because people expect their living standards to rise. And if the only way to have your living standards rise is to take something from somewhere else or someone else, like liberal politics breaks down.
No, I think it's based on a misconception. And that misconception is that there is a straight link between growth and conditions of life for the majority. There isn't. That's gone. There's no link now between GDP growth and employment. There's no link now between GDP growth and real wages. There's no link now between GDP growth and even standards of life for the median person, the average person.
Because obviously there was this article in the FT sort of pushing back against some of the arguments in your Guardian letter, sort of saying that actually the evidence does suggest that there is still quite a strong correlation between median wages and growth. And when wages stagnated in the UK, that was principally because growth has stagnated. Actually, there's been wage compression in the UK because the minimum wage keeps getting increased. Wealth inequality, yes, but sort of when it comes to income and wages, is it clearly the case that growth has become detached from wages?
Well, if you look at the rich countries as a whole, certainly in middle-income countries, but let's just take rich countries for now, for sake of argument. There is no relationship between the median wage and the rate of growth. And one clear evidence of that is that the wage share of national income is falling in pretty much most countries. In the US, you had 35 years of stagnant median wages, when GDP was growing at 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5%. So yes, I would say the evidence is very much the other way. There is no link.
And what about when it comes to developing countries?
Again, there are outliers. China is a huge outlier, okay? My own country, India, we're supposed to be a high growth country. Most of that growth has gone to the top 10%. Our median wages have not just stagnated, they've declined. If you look at, the entire range of workers, informal workers and everyone.
Again, talk me, because I know the data is somewhat disputed here, but I'm going to sort of read what's happened according to the World Bank. And then I know that sort of you in particular have some questions about that. So the standard story about India is that sort of there was liberalization in the 1990s. That meant that the growth rate doubled and that led to poverty declining. So just some statistics from independence until the early 1990s. So that was known as the license Raj. So you've got a heavily regulated economy, growth at about 3% a year. And then after the 1990s, growth goes up to about 6% a year until today. And then according to the World Bank, since 2000, extreme poverty, so that's people living on under $3 a day, has fallen from 50% of the population in 2000 to 5% now. So that would be sort of a classic example people put forward as you have some liberalization, you get some growth, and then poverty falls. What's wrong with that story?
So to start with, poverty in India was measured according to the kind of basic food you could consume. And if you are at the level of consumption where you consume the minimum required calories, that translates into an aggregate spending of so much. And any household below that was defined as poor. What they have done since then is that they have dramatically altered the definition of poverty. Before that, they've also changed the nature of the surveys. So they change the recall period, they add different things. And so all of that helps to kind of show that you have. And they've added various other indicators. So if you happen to have a mobile phone, or maybe you have a two-wheeler, you're not poor. So there's a multitude of different ways in which you basically are comparing apples and oranges now. It's not a trend series. I would argue that increasingly something like a mobile phone is almost like a human right. You cannot access a whole range of things until you use the mobile phone, including minimal government services. So saying that you have a mobile phone means you're not poor is ridiculous. It also doesn't mean many of the families that are defined as not poor are not consuming the minimal food. So the FAO, the last time they brought out this...
Sorry, what's the FAO?
Oh, I'm so sorry. The Food and Agriculture Organization.
Yeah. So it's a UN thing.
It's a UN thing. They have an indicator which they call the ability to afford a nutritious diet. And they define a nutritious diet sort of regionally. So South Asia, there is one nutritious diet. And in 2023, when our official poverty rate was in that region of 5% or something, they found that 71% of the population cannot afford a nutritious diet. So it's if you had gone by the earlier definition, we would still have very high poverty rates.
And so do you think poverty has, because I know there's a big debate about this, and the debate is largely about the extent of the decline of poverty, but do you just think it hasn't fallen at all? And
no, it certainly has fallen.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not that nothing has happened, and life expectancy has increased and all of that. I mean, good things have happened over time, but certainly not to the extent that they are proposed.
Mm-hmm. And you said sort of China's an exception. What's your sort of analysis of China's growth? Because on one level, sort of, there's again an analysis of China whereby they had if you look at Mao, sort of, he talked a lot about equality. He wanted lots of state control over the economy. Obviously, there is still state control of the economy, but he wanted more, basically. Then Deng comes along and says, some people are going to have to get rich first. I think that's literally like a quote from him. They deregulate the economy to a degree. Obviously, it's not shock therapy, as sort of Isabella Weber sort of writes in her book. But he sort of says, actually, to get growth, we're going to need a bit more inequality. And by all accounts, that works. And now China has lifted 800 million people out of poverty. So I suppose, how does your analysis sort of approach that or deal with China's growth?
So China began its reform strategy in a very egalitarian economy. That is to say, you had many, many households at similar levels of income. When you then begin with, first of all, very significant public investment in infrastructure, which we mustn't forget, state control over finance, and state control over some strategic sectors, particularly things like food and essential materials. Then you say to the private sector, yes, you are free to go out and invest. They have the benefit of massive economies of scale. So if you're thinking of, say, two-wheelers, you're not thinking of 100,000 two-wheelers, you're thinking of 100 million two-wheelers. If you're thinking of refrigerators, you're not thinking, again, of 100,000, you're thinking of 10 million. And that really changes your costs, that dramatically increases your incentive to invest and your productivity. So I think the role of economies of scale is completely forgotten. It's such a critical difference between China and India. because China has this huge domestic market. We are a very large population with a small economy. We have a small domestic market because we're so unequal.
Oh, that's interesting. So that's interesting because I was going to say, obviously, you're both very big countries that both started off poor, but China sort of built its own domestic
market
sort of demand. But you're saying India's unable to do that because it's so unequal. And if you built a bigger middle class, then maybe you could get the economies of scale that they achieved in China.
Yes. And often the Chinese success is seen as an export-led success, but it's really an investment-led success. It's high investment, both public and private. They invested 1/5 of GDP in physical infrastructure for 40 years. Building entire cities, roads, bridges, railways, you name it. Okay. But also that economy of scale means that private investors have huge incentives to go out there and they're very cheap. And that makes them very cheap in the global market as well.
The argument that's often made about sort of China's export-led growth, as far as I understand it, is that the importance of exporting was not necessarily just to bring capital in, sort of to get sort of foreign currency, but also that it disciplined Chinese companies. So if you sort of say, what we want you to do is go out and compete on the global market, and if you are successful at competing on the global market, we will, give you some favors, not necessarily in a corrupt way, but sort of some subsidies or whatever, some protections. So is that not essential that sort of you have the disciplining force of global markets whereby if you just support domestic industry regardless, then they end up with sort of poor products? This is what's often the argument that's made about import substitution. Whereas if what you have is an export-led strategy, then your companies are forced to sort of upgrade their technology to be the best, most efficient cars are around instead of being a protected industry.
Oh, there's a lot of truth in that. And if you look at all the success stories, Japan, Korea, et cetera, they all did that. But the critical point you made is that of disciplining your capital. So it's a discipline of all kinds. It's a discipline in terms of the export or the global market that you have to be able to compete. But it's also disciplining in other ways. And I think, again, a big difference between India and China is that China or the other East Asians, even the capitalist ones, were able to discipline their domestic capital, and we were not. So we had import licenses, and then they took the license and just used it to create a monopoly. We had various other kinds of things where large capital was not disciplined. So I think, yes, disciplining domestic capital, including through exposure to global markets, but that's only one way. That's very important.
They did do a lot of things. So I suppose in the Guardian letter, because I think about China a lot and sort of like, I love
Doesn't
these.
everyone?
I love these sort of contradictions in ideology and sort of we support China, but we'd prefer it if they were democratic and they had labor rights and yada, yada. I know in the Guardian letter, you sort of said growth needs to come with workers' rights, needs to come with XYZ. Now, there was presumably a decision made in China to say, for us to have sort of competitive, to some degree, export-led growth, we don't want independent trade unions. They didn't have that. So I suppose Deng Xiaoping, there were a lot of compromises he made that would be, I presume, sort of distasteful to an economist like yourself. And are there any models of development where a developing country has grown without some form of labor oppression, without some form of sort of authoritarian governance, or without just sort of inviting a lot of foreign industry and capital to come and build factories as they do in Bangladesh? Where should people look to for sort of the sweet spot of development?
You mean like the perfect utopian example? I don't think there is. There are, development is a messy process and it involves all kinds of things. In the Chinese case, I would say it was a kind of Faustian bargain that the Chinese state made with its people. And really after the Tiananmen Square uprising, which is that we will give you continually rising growth, real wages, better conditions of life, and you keep your mouth shut. That was the bargain. And they delivered on that for several decades. So it was a bargain, I would say. And that's why they needed that continuous growth in employment and in real wages, which really did grow. This whole idea that there was wage suppression in China is wrong. Wages grew at between 6 to 10% per year.
Well, I suppose the wage suppression was that they didn't have independent trade unions that could go on strike and demand higher wages.
There was labor suppression. There was labor, which is part of the broader undemocratic route, if you like, yeah?
What do you think? Is there a bargain in India? Because I mean, Modi, relatively popular, keeps getting elected. Is there some sort of social bargain which has been met, even if it's one that you're not particularly sort of impressed by?
No, I'm not impressed because it's a bargain based on hate. It's a bargain based on dividing people, on saying, what you really want to be is a Hindu majoritarian state. So you have to hate not just all your neighbors, but you have to hate the 20% of your Muslim population. You have to perhaps begin hating the Christian population. You have to hate potentially people you identify as migrants, and so on. So no, I don't think it's a useful bargain. It's certainly not a good bargain from an economic perspective either. And it is not a bargain that gives you any kind of inclusiveness. So people often talk about labor suppression in China, but there's a lot of labor suppression in India. Very few trade unions are allowed to function. We've had significant labor strikes in the cities I live, in the outer Delhi area, very recently, which have been very brutally suppressed. We are seeing students and youth movement today being very brutally suppressed, and so on. So, yeah, it's unfortunate that we get the authoritarianism without the other side of the Faustian bargain.
And how does the labor suppression work in India? I'm sort of imagining kind of late 19th century America, where you sort of have businesses and the police sort of colluding to violently suppress strikers. Is that what?
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
So you're visiting the UK partly as co-chair of the Independent Commission for the Reform of International Capital Taxation. Talk to me about that. Talk to me about what's that commission for? Why is it necessary? What kind of work are you doing?
Well, this is a commission that began looking specifically at corporate taxation, and specifically multinational corporate taxation, because it was evident that multinational corporations are getting away with paying much lower tax rates, and sometimes almost zero tax rates relative to domestic companies. And that's because they can shift their profits to low tax jurisdictions, the phenomenon known as base erosion and profit shifting. And we argued that you have to stop treating multinational subsidiaries as separate companies. You have to treat them all as part of one company. I estimate their global profits and say that every country should get to tax its share of the global profits according to its own corporate tax rates.
Yeah.
And you could divide that share according to a formula. We suggested sales and employment as, let's say 60-40, some ratio to actually allocate the profit, taxing rights, which is a very sensible thing to do, and which is something that's already done in the United States, for example, because all the states there have separate tax rates, but they use this principle to allocate the taxing rights. So this was one. The other thing we advocated was a principle of minimum tax, a minimum corporate tax, so that you still prevent that race to the bottom. If you can have countries saying that we are going to tax you that difference, if you're going to pretend that all your profits come from a particular tax haven.
So let me just try and, I'm probably going to butcher this, but just to sort of try and put it in as simple as possible terms. In terms of the current system, so a company like Apple, they can say, they can make their iPod and sell it in America, construct it in China, but they might put their intellectual property is housed in Ireland. And so they can say, we've made this much profit, but actually most of the profit is not from sort of the construction of the phone or the sale of the phone. Most of the profit is from the intellectual property. And that happens to be in Ireland, where it's taxed at only 10%. I don't know if it's exactly 10%.
It's 12.5%.
12.5%. And that's basically how they avoid tax.
Absolutely.
And you're saying it should be based on a different sort of criteria, which is where the sale happens and where the construction, the employment happens. And I hadn't realized that the states within the United States, this is already how they work this out.
Yes, exactly.
What's the barrier to that being introduced? Because, on the face of it, that sounds very sensible.
It's political will.
Yeah.
Okay. So the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is like a club of rich countries with a few middle-income countries added, they took on this process. The G20 specifically requested them in 2012, I think. And so from 2013, they started this process of looking at how to do this. And they accepted the principle, both principles. They called it Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. They love pillars, okay? So Pillar 1 was this idea of unitary taxation, just tax Apple as one company. Pillar 2 was the minimum tax. both principles were accepted, but they were watered down so much that it became meaningless. So this is all because of corporate lobbying with the rich country governments that supported the multinationals ultimately. Also, at the very last minute, a lot of these changes happened in the last month of the negotiations. It was like a very long negotiation, 9 years or something. But
is it not? Because I suppose that I find that very persuasive as the explanation as to why it hasn't happened. So is there not a potential opportunity? Because in a way, little countries like Ireland or these tax havens, they're ripping off big, powerful countries like the UK and the United States and France and Germany. So why isn't there a potential coalition of big, powerful countries who say we don't want to be ripped off by Ireland or the Cayman Islands anymore?
Because there's a big, powerful coalition of multinationals who push back.
So you think it's basically just corruption in the West,
I wouldn't even
in the
just
big
call
countries?
it corruption. It's a deeper relationship than just pure corruption. So, the thing is, the pillar 1 thing didn't get accepted finally, but the second pillar, the minimum tax, did get accepted. It was a very low minimum tax, 15%, close to the Ireland rate, right?
Mm-hmm.
So not a great minimum tax, but at least it was a minimum tax. But then the US under Trump persuaded Europe and the G7, and then through the G7, all of the other countries in that process, to exclude US multinationals. I should just mention that US multinationals account for 76% of the profits of the top 4,000 companies in the world.
I mean, what is the corporate tax in America, in the USA?
So their corporate tax at the moment is 21%, but with carve-outs. So
Right.
it comes down.
So it might be below the 15%. Because I'm just thinking if you have a minimum tax of 15%, the real countries that affect
Our Ireland, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. So why does Trump care? If America already charges above that?
Because they don't. A lot of the U.S. multinationals don't declare their profits in the U.S.
So a U.S. company is a company like Apple that's saving lots of money by basing much of its sort of intellectual property in Ireland, and Trump is protecting Apple, essentially. Sorry, I understand.
Mm-hmm.
What is the political strategy to make this work? Because I suppose it's a collective action problem, right? You need all of these countries, or at least the big ones, to agree at the same time. And as far as I understand, under Joe Biden, there was some progress. Joe Biden backed the minimum 15% tax. But then you have a single change of government. Trump comes into power and the whole thing collapses. All the negotiations become pointless, right? Is that not going to keep happening? And I suppose the climate process might have given people a lot of skepticism about the possibility of binding international agreements. Because obviously there were years and years and years from 1997 with the Kyoto Protocol, where there were attempts to form some kind of agreement where countries would be mandated to lower their emissions. Years and years and years, summit after summit after summit. Often the Americans blocking it, but also other countries. And then they decided, this is not going to work. Let's make it voluntary. And people can agree with that or not. But I suppose it might give skepticism that these international negotiations can ever achieve very much, especially if what they achieve is something which is not just voluntary, which is mandatory, where countries are bound by these agreements.
I think a big problem is the separation of these international negotiations from public discourse. So most people don't know what on earth is going on, whether it's in climate or in taxation. And taxation in particular, you mention taxes and people's eyes glaze over. They say, oh, that's too technical, I don't understand it, and it's nothing to do with me. What we really do need is much more public perception of the problem. Whether it's multinationals or very, very rich people who also pay no tax, whether it's Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, personal income tax they don't pay, right? Whereas you and I will pay taxes, and workers in the US will pay taxes. So what we need is public awareness of this and of what matters and what can be done. And then it will be much harder for governments, including the US government, to make these decisions, because it doesn't just affect other countries, it affects people in the US. They're losing out on tax revenue as well.
I know you're in lots of these discussions, you've been campaigning on this a lot. And I suppose, could you give me a bit of geopolitical analysis of how the different countries weigh in on this, right? So I know that there are some European countries who sort of seem quite keen on having minimum corporation taxes and are generally sort of quite pro-regulation and want to rein in sort of multinationals. Obviously, you've got other European countries that are taking advantage of this race to the bottom, like Ireland. I always imagine sort of America generally being pro-corporate. I'm not really sure what China's intervention is in these international coordination problems. But yeah, if you could just sort of talk me through who are the good guys, who are the bad guys when it comes to global taxation?
Well, it's very difficult to say straight good and bad, like all things. But a good arena to look at is the UN negotiations. So you see, what happened is when the OECD negotiations were going in this very direction, sort of pro-multinationals of the rich countries, the Group of Africa really pushed to bring tax negotiations to the UN. And to everyone's shock, surprise, and to my delight, they succeeded. They actually have brought negotiations for a UN tax convention to the UN, and they're ongoing as we speak. And that's a very good place to see who stands where on what, who is really, in hock to the multinationals and who is actually thinking of it differently. So most developed countries are really quite keen on having much more globally progressive systems of taxes, which would actually benefit citizens everywhere. And, it's still most of the tax revenues go to governments in the rich countries. So it would benefit citizens everywhere, who are always being told there's no money for NHS, there's no money for this or that. That's number one. Within the other sort of broader framework, there are, as you mentioned, within the rich countries, there's a group, Spain, for example, and others that, to some extent, France, for digital services tax, etc., that want to have some degree of independent taxing authority and want to retain that autonomy, which, it comes and goes. And of course, then the European Union always votes as a bloc and so on. So it's complicated. But there are countries that would welcome it. But again, in most of these countries, the citizens have no idea what's at stake for them. They don't see this as something that directly affects them, but it actually does. It really matters whether your government is able to generate taxes from those who can afford to pay, which is multinationals and the very rich. It really matters because that affects your public services, that affects your education, that affects health, that affects infrastructure, transport, you name it.
I want to sort of re-ask a question, but frame it differently. Earlier in the conversation, I sort of said, what's the country that's got development exactly right? And you said, obviously, we can't look for perfection. It doesn't, exist around there. Who, I suppose, other than China, because we've talked about China extensively, where do you sort of look around the global economy and think, they're getting it about right? That's where I would point to say, see what's going on there. That's interesting. That's exciting.
For example, Thailand.
Okay. Interesting.
Yes. And the causes of that are not just the usual export-led growth story. Okay. Under a rather unpleasant businessman who ran the country for a while, Thaksin Shinawatra, he did two things which really cemented his popularity, and which is why the subsequent governments had to push him out, but also couldn't get rid of those two things. One was a health scheme. It's called the 32 baht scheme. Baht is their currency. 32 baht is around $1. And the idea is that if you go to that it's a dominantly public system. If you go to the public health system for anything, you pay 32 baht. You can go in for a headache or you can go in for cancer surgery. You pay 32 baht, which means everybody can access it. So this actually had a massive impact. What he did also was that he doubled the health personnel in rural areas and in backward regions, and he gave those doctors, nurses, etc., higher salaries than they would have got in Bangkok. Okay, which meant that there were more people. That also, because we forget that health and education, they're very labor intensive. So that also adds to the local demand in that economy. It kind of rejuvenates those rural economies. Of course, then you had the export-led situation as well. The other thing he had was the million baht scheme. And what's the million baht scheme? Every settlement gets a million baht, which is decided by the local council, how they will spend. A bit, I suppose, like Andy Burnham's idea. But way before Andy Burnham.
Should he be looking to Thailand?
He should. I think it's a very good idea.
And that's really interesting. I mean, we rarely talk about Thailand on the show. There's lots of these countries. We always talk about China, the United States, and then Europe. And there's so many sort of middle powers or sort of middle-sized countries that I wish we talked about more. I want to go back
Let's
to
say 85% of the global population.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We talk about, I mean, China's already a
Okay,
fifth, isn't it? So
okay, 70%.
70%, still a lot.
Yeah.
I want to go back to something you said, which is they also did the export-led growth. And I suppose the counter-argument, well, not necessarily counter-argument, but sort of the argument that would often be put forward is, yes, it's brilliant that Thailand did that. Great social policy. Obviously, a strong state intervention saying we're not just going to leave this to the market. But the only reason they had the capacity to do that and the money to do that is because they also had sort of successfully mastered or at least progressed when it comes to capitalist export-led growth. What do you think of that argument?
Again, I don't dispute that. But what allows you to do your capitalist export-led growth? It's infrastructure, it's a trained workforce, both of which you will not get just through private investment. I mean, that China story also, as I told you, 1/5 of GDP spent on infrastructure, right? Thailand also, you spend on infrastructure, you spend on education, you spend on ensuring that your working class has decent places to live. Okay, transport is still a problem, especially in metropolitan Bangkok, but you get some of the basics right. And that makes it cheaper even for private capital.
I suppose I'm trying to work out sort of how radical the argument is in a way, because sort of to say we want capitalist export-led growth and then strong states that can provide public goods is quite mainstream.
Oh, absolutely. This is all very, very reformist. Yeah. This is all low-hanging fruit, shall I say. This is all stuff that most countries can do without a dramatic change in economic system.
Yeah.
I think what we do have to recognize is that the other big, if you like, cancer eating up the system is inequality. And Thailand, China, any other success story you want to identify, they are all unequal societies. And at some point, that also becomes a major concern. And it's a concern at two levels. One is because of the fact that the inequality is associated often with much more fragile material living conditions of the people. But the other is at the top. The concentration of wealth, not just income, but wealth, gives power. And that power is used to influence regulations, institutions, and policies to further add to inequality. And so you really have to address that. You have to address that certainly through what is now called pre-distribution. That is the whole system of rules, regulations, institutions, etc., that enable the rich to just accumulate more and more. Privatizing of things, of services, etc., etc. The rules that allow you to destroy environmental conditions, to avoid minimal labor regulation, etc. All of that regulatory stuff, but also redistribution. We do not tax the extremely wealthy. The richest people in the world don't pay personal income taxes, which is unbelievable when you think about it, but it's true. So we do have to have a system of wealth tax for the super rich.
And is that distinct from the corporate tax we talked about earlier?
This is about people. This is about individuals.
Yeah.
So we have today, as I said, not just the biggest concentration of corporate power, but the biggest concentration of individual wealth power ever, globally. I mean, I believe in human history because it's a global thing, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, one man controls not only what used to be, if you like, the sort of social town square, and can just buy it up because he feels like it and change it as he wishes. But he also owns half the satellites going around Earth. Can you think of that? I mean, it's unbelievable, right? We have allowed such a concentration of power. So first of all, shouldn't be allowed. A public town square should be a public utility. It shouldn't be private. Satellites, one person should not be allowed to own a company that owns half of them, and so on. But there is also the taxation of those people. That person can get away without paying income tax. Why? Because you can put it in different, in trusts, in different kinds of other, limited liability companies, et cetera, so that actually you don't have any income to speak of. You're indebted for everything that you do, okay? The way to get around that is to actually tax on wealth, a relatively small amount, say 2%, okay? As Gabriel Zucman has suggested, say 2% on the wealth. That's, by the way, only the known wealth. We don't know about the resources, the paintings they have hidden away in basements and stuff like that. But the financial and real estate known wealth, tax 2% of that. And the estimates are that that still amounts to, depending on different indicators, between 10 to 16% of an income tax rate, which is way lower than most normally salaried workers pay. So a wealth tax would enable you to avoid the tax avoidance, if you like. Yeah. And Gabriel Zucman's idea, which is a very good one, is that it doesn't have to be in the form of a wealth tax. You could make it a dividend tax, you could make it something else. But everybody should be paying up to 2% of that wealth. And it doesn't have to be for everybody. That's the other fear about a wealth tax, that it will hit all, if you have a house or you can't leave money for your kids, a few £1,000 that you've saved up, etc. No, it's not that. It's about the super rich, and which is a different level for every country. But, Gabriel has suggested it's for billionaires globally. There are only about 3,000 of them. You could do it for centimillionaires, about, 40,000 of them. You could do it, Colombia brought in a wealth tax of 1.5% for anyone holding more than $15 million. Relative to Colombia's income, that's a lot.
And when was that? Because the argument people always make is it's a good idea, people introduce it, then it doesn't raise as much money as they thought. Some people leave and then they drop it. What happened in Colombia?
Completely wrong. So it was when Jose Antonio Ocampo was the finance minister in only 9 months, but he managed to bring in this wealth tax of 1.5%, only 1.5% on those having more than $15 million. And that brought in 0.75% of GDP, which is not a small amount because it's really a handful of people. It's a couple of hundred people max.
When was this, sorry?
This was in 2020.
Sorry, I don't want this to become a quiz. But
yeah.
But
because, there have
but
been...
very recently is what I mean.
Very recently, 2023.
So this was under AMLO? No, that's Mexico.
No,
This was under Gustavo Petro.
Gustavo Petro, that's right. It was a brief period when he was finance minister, but he brought in this law, 0.75% of GDP, not a small number, okay? Before he brought it in, there were all these threats. Oh my God, the rich will leave, it'll cost more to implement, etc. Not true at all, because now you have the exchange of banking information. Colombia is a member of OECD, so it has access to that. It's very easy to work out at least the financial wealth. And nobody left. They threatened to leave, but nobody really wants to leave. You have your friends, your family, your daughter's going to get married, whatever. You don't actually leave, right?
Especially because the money's you're not really going to notice if it's gone.
Exactly. It's like, look, 1.5%, it's like a stock market valuation change for them. It really doesn't matter. The reason they object so strongly is because they don't want anything to affect their power.
Did you see Jensen Huang? So he's the CEO of NVIDIA. And there's a ballot initiative, isn't there? I'm sure you know more about this than I do. In California, where they proposed a 5% tax on people, billionaires or people who earn over £1 billion. And there were a number of sort of people who've said if this happens, they'll leave or they've left already. So I think Elon Musk has relocated and a couple of others. And they asked Jensen Huang if he would leave. I think he's the 9th richest person in the world now. And he says, no, I like California. There's lots for us in Silicon Valley, so I'm just happy to pay it. I watched that and I didn't know if he was being cynical because he thinks it's not going to pass anyway and that makes him sound good, or if he really meant that he is more than happy to pay 5% of his wealth, which I think will amount to about 7 billion.
Well, if you look at the observed reality in countries that have wealth taxes, very few people have left. There are always a few high-profile cases that make it to the newspapers, but actually a very small proportion do finally leave for all of the social, cultural, and other reasons that I mentioned. But also, even if they do leave, you can have an exit tax. And many countries in the world have an exit tax. The US, for example, has an exit tax, but at different levels and types. So do France and Germany and, lots of countries.
The other issue is who gets to do the taxing, right? Because I was thinking about this with California. So California, presumably, I would imagine, has sort of the most billionaires in America because they're so tech-focused, sort of the super wealthy in America. So if they do that tax, then they get the money. But then if, like Ohio does the same tax, I don't know how many billionaires they have. So should it be, for fairness reasons, should it be a nationwide tax or should it be a global tax? Because obviously, there are a bunch of sort of countries in the global south where they introduce a billionaire tax and they don't raise much money because they don't have any billionaires.
Yes, but I would say you adjust it for your level of income, right? As I said, in Colombia, it was $15 million.
Yeah.
So
So you think every country in the world could introduce a wealth tax and it would still be worth it?
yeah, because you're targeting your super rich.
And every country in the world has a super rich, even if it's,
unfortunately,
even if
yes.
it's not by international standards, by domestic standards,
Exactly.
yes. And then that money will also go further in that country.
Exactly.
Final question. What gives you hope?
Finally, the young people, because, we have given them a really horrible world to deal with. I mean, in every possible way, right? The climate breakdown, the ecological disaster, the inequality, the
Smartphones.
Smartphones, I'm mixed.
Sorry, I'm shoehorning that.
Yeah, I'm mixed on smartphones. But in general, we've given them a pretty horrible world. But I find my students, the young people I meet, somehow they are able to handle this much better than, say, me. Because I grew up in a much easier world. So maybe I just got soft because of that. They are tougher, they are braver, and they're smarter. So I have hope because of that.
It's a very different narrative to what lots of people are putting forward at the moment, which is to say because of smartphones, everyone's lost the ability to think or speak or write or whatever. But you're positive about the next generation, which is nice to hear.
Yeah, I mean, most of the people who say that are older people. But
I say it, and I'm fairly young, but
okay.
I probably say it too much.
But you will find very few millennials saying this. I do think AI is a threat. I think AI is reducing the ability to think. But before that, I mean, most of the young people I meet are really smart.
Jayati Ghosh, thank you so much for joining me in the studio at Novara Media. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.